Alright, the wonderful world of drawing here. This is our first media of art. So how is drawing achieved? Our technique here is that we're trying to get some type of contrast. Even to draw a simple line, we need some type of contrast between the background and the line we're drawing. Now, with more types of advanced drawings, like we see in this example here, basically we're going to use shading. We're going to use a special word here that we're going to go over in a little while, chiaroscuro, which basically means light and dark here. And that's the way we achieve the illusion of three-dimensional form, like in this example here. Okay, so let's look at a couple of things here we're going to have to know here with drawing. Okay, so that first word that I said earlier is chiaroscuro at the top. It's pronounced chiaroscuro. It's an Italian word, and it means the interplay of light and dark, which creates the illusion of three-dimensional form. And there's several ways we can achieve chiaroscuro. And the bottom section here on this little slide here shows us that we could achieve chiaroscuro by blending. We could use cross-hatching. We could use hatching. We can use contour hatching. Or we could use a technique called stippling. Okay, so we're going to go over each of those individually. But these are basically our definitions here. Blending achieves form through values of light and dark that are created by the process of building up and taking away the drawing material across the surface of the picture plane. Okay, so that's a little bit wordy definition. All we really need to know is that blending is what it sounds like. You're moving your drawing material across the surface of the picture and building up form there that way. Now, with some materials, that's going to work very well. With other materials, that's not going to work so well. For instance, like a pen or with a marker, we're really not able to blend it, and so we have to use a technique called hatching. With hatching, we have lights and darks, and we create those lights and darks using parallel lines, and the value that we get is really visually blended by the eye. And so an offshoot of hatching is cross-hatching, where values are built up using hatch marks, and those are intersected by other hatch marks. And that's how we build up the light to progressively more dark, the more crossed hatch marks that we have. And then the last type of hatching there is contour hatching, where we have hatch marks that are curved, and they curve along the surface of the object being represented. Okay, and so we'll see an example of that as well. And then the last one there, stippling. It's the same idea, but instead of using lines like we have with hatching, we simply use dots. And again, like the first one, or like the hatching I should say, that tone is visually blended. Okay, so here's our first example of something that would be blended. As you can see here, the material is just moved across the surface, and where you have the darker areas, you have more of that material built up, and in the lighter areas, it's really the light of the paper that's being shown through, and so it has a less amount of that material built up. In this case, that material is charcoal, which we'll look at those tools here in a little bit as well. But you can use your eraser for this technique. You can go back in and always lighten places up if you want to. So it's a technique that a lot of artists use because it's easy to kind of manipulate form. If you've made something too dark, you can just go ahead and make it lighter. And if it's something that's lighter, you can just go ahead and go back in and make it dark. Okay, this is our first of the hatching techniques. And you can see we're just using these parallel lines here, and where you see those parallel lines spaced out somewhat, you see a lighter tone, and the closer those lines are, the more lines there are, the darker the tone is. Okay, so if you notice with most hatch marks, especially with old Renaissance drawings like this one, this is an example of a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, that the direction they go is a diagonal direction, and that is to make the drawing look a little bit more lively than if it was just a horizontal or a vertical hatch mark. Okay, this is an example of cross-hatching from an artist named Morandi, who did a lot of still lifes like this. And you can see that the grays and the darker values building up towards black, they're achieved through these hatch marks that are going opposite directions. And so you can go one direction, then go over the other direction, maybe vertically, then maybe diagonal, and then maybe diagonal the other way, and get even a darker value. And depending on the different directions you go, how many lines you have, that's what builds up the light and dark. Okay, so this is just cross-hatching. With both hatching and cross-hatching, those are pretty much straight parallel lines with hatching, and then they cross here with cross-hatching. Okay, this technique's a little bit different. This one's the contour hatch marks. And with this example by Albert Dürer here, we have a gray background, and the darks are achieved by basically having hatch marks in black, and the lights are achieved by hatch marks in white. And so if you look there in the sleeve, for instance, you can see that the hatch marks are moving across the form of the sleeve. If you look in the hand, you can see that the hatch marks are moving along the form of the hand. That those hatch marks aren't straight all the time, they're curving around with the surface of what it's trying to describe. So this is a technique that we see a lot with printmaking, and then you can really move along from contour hatching and go to cross contour hatching like we see in this example here. Okay, so this obviously here is a dollar bill that's zoomed in on the face of Mr. George Washington here. And if we notice that his face and the background, all of that is built up with lines using different type of hatching techniques. In the face we have contour hatching. We see a little bit of cross contour in his jacket there. And in the background you can see basic cross hatching. In this case, vertical and horizontal lines are giving us that background there. So this is a good example of how we can use cross contour hatch marks to get a realistic human form here. Okay, and this is our last example. This would be stippling. You can see here the artist is using dots, and where there's a lot of dots we get a really dark value. When there's not a lot of dots we get a lot of light values. And so it's a way that that again the eye will visually blend this to give us these medium tones in between the light and the dark. In this case, the dark of the ink and the light of the paper. Okay, so those are our different techniques. And what we'll go over here for the rest of this section is our different drawing tools. Okay, and so it's going to be important for our test here in Media of Art that we are able to distinguish between our different drawing tools. First of all, we need to be able to distinguish between our different media. Since this is the first one, we don't really have much to distinguish right now. But certainly with our different drawing tools, they're all going to look different. Okay, and so for instance, with a pencil and with ink, we should probably already know the differences between pencil and ink since we've used them so often. So with some of the others, we're going to have to rely on looking at visual examples here. But I have a little write-up here on some of the characteristics of each of these. So with pencil, we get kind of a middle gray in its natural value. It is workable because it has an eraser. It's something we can erase. It gives us a very precise line, and so with that we can blend this material. We can also use hatching with this material, and all of those different types of hatching. We can use cross hatching, contour hatching, etc. With a pencil. With the charcoal, it's naturally a little bit darker in value than our pencil. It's also very workable. You can really blend charcoal very well. You can erase it as well too. The difference with charcoal is it's got more of a textured line than pencil, in addition to being darker as well. And so that type of natural texture a lot of times will give you a different atmosphere to a charcoal drawing than you would have in a pencil drawing. But certainly we can do blending, hatching, all of those techniques we can do with pencil, we can do with charcoal. Don't get as precise of a line with charcoal either. Okay, so we see a lot of pencil, we see a lot of charcoal, and the third one we see a lot of ink as well. With ink, it can be drawn with a pen or a brush. And depending on what you use, a pen or a brush, it can give you a variety of different marks. With a brush, we'll get a very kind of gestural line that gets a lot of activity to it, some movement to that line. With a pen, it's going to be something a little bit more controlled, and that's what's going to give us this precise line with the pen and ink. And so, with the last thing there, variety of marks, that's something we can certainly be accomplishing with ink. Okay, so maybe a couple of ones we're not as familiar with. Here's Conte crayon, C-O-N-T-E, and there's actually supposed to be a little accent over the E that I couldn't figure out how to do here on my keyboard, but that's its official spelling there, and the last word crayon. So Conte crayon. And with Conte crayon, we start to have a little more variety here with colors. Most of the Conte crayon colors are going to be the earth tone, so it's going to be some kind of orange or red or dark maroon, somewhere in that neighborhood. And it's going to be a lot like charcoal. With Conte crayon, what we actually do is it's similar to charcoal in its makeup. It's compressed into sticks like charcoal, but it's got a little bit of a natural clay mixed in, and so that's what's giving us the earth tone color there. And it acts similar to charcoal. It's got a textured line like charcoal, not quite as much texture, but certainly more than pencil. It's also very workable. You can erase it, and so you can blend it, and of course you can use the hatching lines as well too. And our last drawing tool is pastel. Sometimes you see this grouped in with painting, but most of the time with pastel you're really using kind of a stick. So we'll group it in here with the drawing tools. And with pastel we really have a wide range of color. Really all the colors are available to us. It has a limited workability in comparison with something like a charcoal that's going to blend very easily because we're working with different pigments. It's not going to quite blend the same way. It's not going to be as reworkable. You're not really going to be able to erase it as much as you'd be able to erase maybe another drawing tool. Okay, so let's look at some visual examples here. Okay, this is the first one. This is pencil. And pencil is really good for different sketches like this, like we see here. And so if you take a little time to look at the composition here, we'll see a variety of those different techniques that we saw. We see some of that hatching in the front foreground as well as the background with the trees. We see some blending, especially in that where that car is there. The car is blended for the most part, and a lot of the middle ground there is blended as well. And so it's good to notice here with the pencil that not only in the drawing but underneath in the letters we are using the pencil as well. So we have that precise line. One reason you would use a pencil for taking notes or something like that is it's because of that consistent precise line, and as we mentioned, the blending and hatching capabilities that we have too. Now, while in its natural kind of state there, if you just were to draw like one line with pencil, it would be kind of a medium gray. You certainly can build up the dark values, and you can get a lot of detail with this particular tool here as well. This next slide is an example of that. Okay, so you can see how in the background we have really it gets to that all the way to that black, and then we're using all the way to the white in terms of our chiaroscuro, chiaroscuro, our light and dark. And so here we just see kind of precise example as far as rendering, as far as the light and dark, and that's how we can get this really realistic image here. And so we can get that full value range with pencil. It's just with the blacks we need to really kind of work to get our dark values here with pencil. Okay, this next example is an example of charcoal. It's a little bit easier to get our black values with charcoal because it is darker, and because it is really kind of messy when you work with charcoal. It gets everywhere a lot of times. But The positive side of that is it's easy to get a lot of that material in the drawing paper, and so it's easier to get these black tones. And so we really get a full range with charcoal too, and it's easier to get those grays, easier to get those darks with charcoal than pencil. That's why it's used a lot for drawing classes like this example here. So again, we're just getting our drawing done this way, just concentrating here on the different values, the lights and darks of the scene. Okay, so with most of this is blended for the most part, and so I wanted to give you an example of charcoal that wasn't blended on that front here. Here is this drawing. It's by an artist named Kathy Kolowitz, and this is her self-portrait here. And so you can see this not being blended. We can see the texture of the stick of charcoal. And since it's a self-portrait, we can actually see the tool she's working with there in her hand. And if we notice that little line that represents the surface that she's drawing on there, if we really look closely at that line, we can see that it really gives us more of a textured line with this tool, charcoal, than we would get with a pencil. With a pencil we get much more precise line. This one's a little bit more jagged, a little more frayed, and that just speaks to the natural texture of the tool. Okay, so far we have pencil, and we just went over charcoal. So the next one here is ink. Okay, you can see that this would be an example of ink using ink in its kind of full fluid manner using a brush. And so you can see some of the activity, some of the vibrancy of the brush strokes, or in here the gesture marks that we see. That a drawing like this has a lot of energy because of the fluidity of the ink using with the brush. And so you can get different effects like this with ink. You can see a little ink wash in there as well. When you mix water with the ink, it's going to make a little bit of a lighter value in there as well. You can see that, for instance, in the bottom left corner. But it's a good example of the vitality that you can get with these types of marks using the ink with the brush. Okay, this is an example of ink with a pen, and this is going to be much more controlled. It's actually kind of hard to see, but those great values in the backgrounds are achieved basically just through different cross-hatched lines. That's basically how this whole image is built up, and we have a full range value from very light to very dark here. And so again, this is an example of how we would have a lot more precision, how we wouldn't have as much of that fluidity or that gestural quality with the brush, but we can have the control here with the ink pen. And so that variety is one reason why we would see ink a lot as well. Alright, so now we move on to Conte crayon. And so you can see with Conte crayon here that it has that earth tone type of look to it. It's got like a reddish, orangish, brownish type of look to it. And you can see it behaves similar to charcoal. We have this textured line again. This is an example of how they're not really using blending for this drawing. It's just the line. And you can see how, again, that line acts very, very similar to the textured line of charcoal. And this is an example of Conte crayon that would be blended. Okay, so again, very reworkable here. We can move it around, we can lighten it up with the eraser, we can get really dark values like we see in there as well by building it up. And so again, it's very very blendable, similar to charcoal. Okay, this example is a pastel. Okay, pastels, we have a full range of color available to us, and I thought this was a really good example of a pastel drawing here. This was done by a contemporary artist here, this little landscape that we see there. And with this one, this is an example of a self-portrait done by Chardin, who is a pretty well-known French painter. He did a lot of still lives, things along those lines. And he was pretty well renowned for his ability to kind of pick up on the nuances of color, and so this is a really good example here of a pastel drawing. In this case, it's self-portrait. Now, with all of these, there's been a tool used in all of these that we actually haven't mentioned yet. Okay, and if we look at this particular example here, we can see that something that is going to have an effect on the drawing that is not the drawing material itself would be the surface that you're drawing on. Okay, so you could draw on a lot of different things, but the majority of the time, the great majority of the time, we will see drawings that will have been drawn on paper. Okay, and so for this section, the important thing for you to know is the term tooth, which is T-O-O-T-H, tooth. And what that refers to is a rough grain of paper. Okay, a rough grain of paper is known as tooth. If a piece of paper has you know, a lot of texture to it, then we would say that that piece of paper has a lot of tooth. Okay, now with some examples in drawing, you might see medias mixed. For instance, in this one, the majority of it is charcoal, but if you see, it's kind of got this kind of haunting glow to it, and that's achieved by mixing it with a different material for those light values. And so we'll see that a lot in some of these drawings that are a representation like this, or a drawing like this that's a little bit more, I guess, out of the norm. Here, our piece of paper is a police form, and we're getting an ink wash there. That's the white is there, there in the midground there, and that gives us a better base to see the drawing, which is done here by a pencil on top of the paper on top of the ink wash. And so here's another example, just like the one above, of how you can definitely mix media, you know, within drawing to achieve different things. Okay, and then the last things we're going to look at here for this section in drawing is kind of untraditional materials. Okay, so this is an example of something we'd see in the contemporary art world, on how within this room here we have this white interior, and how the artist is essentially using tape here to create that contrast between light and dark. And so they're creating tape to create these lines to essentially draw with. Okay, so that's again one material that's somewhat untraditional that the artist is using here. Okay, and this would be another example by the contemporary artist Chuck Close. Here he's using something that would be pretty traditional. It's ink is what he's using, but the method he's using to record the portrait here is simply his fingertip. And so if you were to put your fingertip in ink, and it would collect you know, a good amount of ink, and then put it on the paper, by the second or third time that you rolled your ink, or I should say your finger across the sheet of paper without dipping it in the ink again, and by that time you're going to get a lighter value. And so you can see that's where the lighter values are. The really dark values he's going over several times, probably with his fingertip in the same spot to get those dark values. And so it's a good example of how, you know, lights and darks are created using the material, in this case ink, to get, in this case, the portrait of who I believe was the artist's friend. Okay, so this will conclude our segment on drawing, and our next media of art is going to be painting.